Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started. I'm Mike Joy from the Institute of Governance and Policy Studies, and I've been looking at freshwater for a couple of decades now in New Zealand and in different places around the world, and most of what I've found is the huge impact of agriculture on freshwater and other associated aquatic systems. And it's really hard trying to find solutions, and it's really easy to see where we've gone wrong. So it's not often that I have a positive thing to say, but I have to say that regenerative agriculture, and it's talked about a lot, but we can grow food without having the impacts and have multiple benefits from it. And so that's why I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Shane today as a kind of a practitioner of regenerative agriculture. There's lots of ways of describing it, but that will do for a start. And so an opportunity for us to see how we could be doing it so differently in New Zealand and globally for that matter. So Shane's based in Melbourne, but he'll be coming back to live in New Zealand for in another year's time. We went to Landcorp, where I'm an environmental reference group yesterday, and there was some really positive sounding people within Landcorp who are keen to really progress this kind of thing with New Zealand's biggest farmer, Landcorp. So I hope that will progress. But anyway, I'll hand over to Shane now to talk about regenerative agriculture. Thanks, Shane.
Thanks, Mike. So yeah, I mean, I think Mike's right. You know, we do have a lot of good news to share, but the reality is that, you know, before we get to dessert, you are going to have to eat your greens. So I will be starting today, of course, recapping some of the challenges that we face, but I'm not going to linger too long on that. So my name's Shane Ward. That's me, and this is the kind of stuff that I'm into. I started Action Ecology as a consultancy to work in design and management problem solving, and trying to connect people with the right kind of knowledge, whether that be scientific knowledge or whether that be best practice from on the ground all over the world. And the idea was to try and help people manage land and design land in a way that makes it better over time, not worse. And we do that by regenerating instead of degrading, by working with rather than against natural systems. So that means I own lab coats and gumboots, but of course never went together because that would be creepy. Before that, I had a career in corporate communications. For a while, I worked in large FTSE 100 organisations in London, and I worked in the property, insurance, financial services, banking and energy sectors, and was involved with a lot of large-scale organisational change. So it's not a very common combination, and I suppose that means that hopefully I've got something relatively interesting to say today. So what we're going to cover, what we're going to talk about, can be broken down into 4 sections. What is the problem exactly? You know, what are we facing, and what happens if we keep going business as usual? Why do we have this problem? Because it's not a series of accidents that's led us here. I think that there is important lessons to be understood about, you know, why we're in this situation. What can we do about it? And how do we do that? And I think that maybe there's a few things in there that maybe not what you're expecting. So let's get into it. I don't think we can really address the scale of this challenge until we fully understand exactly what it is. So what do we face if we continue with business as usual? If we don't take urgent and transformative action to address these crises, what's that look like? Well, warming, obviously. The IPCC report that came out last year was saying that as it is, we'll be facing around 3 to 4 degrees of warming. But the important point here is that that does not include any positive feedback loops. For those of you that aren't familiar with that term, that's essentially just a way of saying a cycle that is self-reinforcing. It magnifies its own effects. So once it kicks off, it accelerates. Once you start to factor those things in, many have said we're actually looking at closer to 4 to 5 degrees. And this is average warming, remember. It will be warmer in some places, a bit less in others. The question has come up, Would 1 billion people survive? Many think half that. There's no evidence to suggest that humanity can actually survive at this sort of temperature. And again, that even if they did, would that be a success? This is a situation which is unprecedented for our species. We have never lived in an environment like that. So it's really important to understand that. Extreme weather. Lots of bad things happening. The one that I want to draw your attention to, however, is volatility. When we're thinking about civilization, the key thing, of course, is we need to eat. So what underpins that? Agriculture. We depend on plants. Plants are the basis for our entire food system. When you have increased volatility, you run into the problem that there are no plants that have evolved to deal with a frost one week, a scorching heat wave the next, etc. When you have even warming or even seasons, if everything just got a little bit warmer, well, that'd be fine. You could just change your crops around. But it's the volatility that's the real problem, and that's the kind of thing that keeps a lot of people up at night at the moment. The analysis that came out recently was saying that increasing aridity and these effects would be driving people away from the equatorial regions towards the higher latitudes. And New Zealand, of course, being right in the path of that potential mass migration situation. I mean, you think you've got a housing problem now. Ice. It's melting faster than ever and seems to be accelerating, defying predictions. The big one here is the Arctic death spiral, which is a great name. Runaway thawing of permafrost, which has locked away tons and tons and tons, hundreds of billions of tons of methane and CO2. That's a great example of a positive feedback loop. Once that starts to warm and starts to release it, there's nothing we can do about that. So we really, really want to make sure that doesn't happen. Oceans, all kinds of problems there. By 2100, sea level rise, basically no more coral reefs to speak of. But the one that I want to draw your attention to is decreased photosynthesis. So this is one that doesn't get talked about that much. The vast majority of the world's plants are marine algae. They are also the world's largest carbon sink. So they're the things that are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. If we affect the oceans to the point where they reduce in number or effectiveness, that is another positive feedback loop, which could be extremely problematic, to put it mildly. Biodiversity, entering the 6th mass extinction event of this planet, due, well, pretty much entirely to us. Massive impacts for our food system. I mean, aside from the actual loss of the diversity itself, how it affects us is going to be significant. Land use, driving a lot of this stuff. The thing which I want to draw your attention to here is soil loss, this last one. A football field a minute. 9 million hectares a year. That's about the size of Ireland. That's how much we're losing. The FAO said about a third of the world's soil has already been degraded, and if current rates of degradation continue, all the world's topsoil could be gone in 60 years. That's 60 harvests. The only problem with that was 15 years ago. So the thing we need to be mindful of is it's not really whether it's 45 years or 50 or 42. That's really not the point. The point is that the way that we're doing this is going to end one way or another. There isn't any other option if we continue like this. It's just going to end. Economics. I mean, we have a ludicrous macroeconomic model that completely ignores the fact that we live on a finite planet, as has been pointed out by many people. Insurance. I think this is a really interesting point. Many people, big reinsurers in Europe, have been talking for about a decade now, asking long-term questions about, is insurance even a business that will be possible by the end of the century? And that has really big implications for, who can build where, who gets to rebuild after disasters, etc. Geopolitical situation. Many people that sort of work in this area have been pointing out that the next big thing could be mass migration, climate refugees. But the thing which really struck me as well is this idea of climate apartheid, that the ability for some people to defend, be resilient against these changes is, of course, not even. An example was in 2012, Hurricane Sandy was wreaking havoc on New York City and stranding low-income and vulnerable people with no access to power, healthcare, etc. However, Goldman Sachs headquarters was protected by tens of thousands of its own sandbags and generators which could keep the whole thing running. I think that's a really crystal clear example of, at a small scale, what we'll be looking at. The UN has said that human rights may not survive the coming upheaval. When we talk about resource use, which of course underpins a lot of this stuff, and some of you may be familiar with this idea of the number of Earths, how many, in terms of resources, how much are we using each year? At the moment, the global average is 1.7 Earths worth of resources every year. In New Zealand, 2.9. So it now takes the Earth 1 year and 8 months to regenerate what we use in a year on average, and of course more in New Zealand. I mean, that's not the worst, but the point is, nevertheless, it doesn't matter. As long as it's above 1, then you've got a problem to deal with. The world is likely to be a very turbulent place by 2100 if we continue as we are. That's the message. Earth Overshoot Day, that marks the point at which we cross over, gets earlier every year. It's currently at July 29. And the UN Environment Programme pointed out that if we continue to use resources like there's no tomorrow, then for many people there won't be one. So we have an increasing number of warnings, and they're getting increasingly more severe. But the change doesn't seem to be appearing. The target is quite clear. The IPCC say we need to hit net zero emissions by 2050 to avoid a 50-50 chance at staying under 1.5 degrees average warming. So this means every sector of every country has to be net zero. Energy, transport, industry, agriculture, the lot, everywhere. So why are we here? Yes, it's about the things that we've done, but there's something in common, I think. I think it's a mindset that's led us here. It's the way that we see and the way that we react to the world. That forms the basis of our decision making. And I would say that this is about the industrial mentality. It's about the machine metaphor that we use to understand the world around us and that we apply when we develop our systems and try to use them to interact with it. And the same thinking that got us into this mess will clearly not get us out of it. So, how we see the world. We invent boundaries, imaginary boundaries, to take complexity and to make it simple so that it's understandable. We can work with it. And as those boundaries narrow, I think that it does two things. Yes, it makes complex things simple, but it also reduces our ability to see the entirety of what we're dealing with, and it blinds us to some of the solutions to the problems that we're creating. We look at systems as machines. And this analogy is quite obvious when we think about the way we think about bodies, minds, nature. Minds are like computers, aren't they? Bodies, machines, they're mechanical. They perform mechanical actions. Nature is a complex series of inputs and outputs. Well, I think a good example of this one would be nutrition. We often think about the body as something that requires vitamins, minerals, nutrients that go into it, and that allows us to perform chemical work. But as has been demonstrated quite well by a lot of the recent research into the microbiome and so forth, it's revealed that, of course, we're not machines, we're organisms. And there's a fundamental difference the way organisms work. You can take one part of an organism out, perhaps, or have it impaired, and other parts will take over to help that function continue. It's a complex series of interactions. So this machine thinking is a completely inappropriate metaphor. It may seem like a subtle point, but it has massive ramifications for the way that we treat living systems. And the way that we do that is by imposing pattern through design. And this can be visible quite clearly in our education system. Some of you may be familiar with this. If you're not, you should check it out. So Ken Robinson does a great TED talk called Changing Education Paradigms. And he makes this point really well, where he talks about the education system that we have in the Western world as being modelled on and built for the industrial system. For example, how the thing that all children have most in common is their date of manufacture, their age, and how they're put through this production line system, churned out the other end, ready for the marketplace, for the workplace. And he goes on and elaborates all the reasons why. But it's a really good point, and I think it's just one more thing that highlights what I'm talking about, how we've taken this thinking and we've applied it to all these things. It affects also the way that we tackle problems. We think short term, not strategic. We're not thinking about what one thing is going to lead to next, and then what does that lead to, and how does that build into something over time? Where are we going with it? We always try to look for minimal change. What's the least amount that we need to do? Right? It's this mitigation mindset. If we're creating a problem, maybe we can just keep doing exactly what we're doing, but just a little bit less bad. And this, I think, is really problematic, considering what we're facing. We're always trying to preserve the status quo. So, what we want, therefore, are silver bullet solutions. What's the least thing? What's this one new thing that we can do that's going to fix it all, so we can just keep going with what we're doing? And we see them all the time. Electric cars. Absolutely, yeah, we need electric cars. In fact, every car should be an electric car, but we're going to need a lot less of them. A lot. We can't just take all the cars we've got now and replace them with electric ones and problem solved. Keep going. Plant trees. Absolutely, we need to be planting billions and billions of trees, and we need to be doing it all around the world, and we need to be doing it yesterday. But that can't be a license to continue emitting burning fossil fuels and emitting carbon into the atmosphere. You don't sort of get a get out of jail free card. Lab-grown meat. Yeah, great, exciting. Does that solve the problem with agriculture? Absolutely not. Carbon capture and storage. This is a brilliant one. We always hear this one. This is also sort of mentioned in the IPCC report as kind of the silver bullet that will kind of get us out when things get really bad. The reality is that most of the funding for this goes to what they call EOR, which is enhanced oil recovery, which is a great way of getting extra hard-to-reach oil and so forth out of the ground. And the reality is that to mitigate just 14 to 20% of the emissions in 2050, the whole CCS industry will need to be between 2 and 4 times larger than the entire oil and gas industry is now. An industry that has been built up around the world over 100 years, and we've got 30 years to do that. So, and of course, even after you manage that, you still need to find safe geologic strata in which to store this carbon, which no one has yet worked out how to do. So there is no one solution to fix this, and I think we just really need to knock that idea on the head. The status quo cannot be saved, and it's our mentality that's and shaping our relationship to the world through this mentality that is the root cause of it. So I think a perfect example of this is the mentality that we have. It's a mentality of inheritance. We have a sort of warped sense of reality which is fueled figuratively and literally by fossil fuels. For example, coal. What's coal? Okay, well, it's plants. It's a carboniferous forest over hundreds of millions of years, photosynthesizing, just like every plant is doing right now. Of every second of sunshine, fantastic, it's locking away carbon. Geology works on it, becomes coal. We dig it up, fantastic. We can do amazing things with it. And we have done amazing things with it. We've built huge food-producing systems. We've built an entire interconnected world of cities. You know, we've even built our dreams on it. But it's a lie. It's a false promise. Because really what we are is we're trust fund babies. We've been dining out on this energy inheritance for over 2 centuries. Millions of years of solar energy stored up, saved for us, like an inheritance, and suddenly we're granted it. And we do all these amazing things, it's fantastic, but hundreds of millions of years we've burnt through in less than 200, most of it in the last few decades. It was never going to last anyway. But the fact is that it's been around just long enough that we've sort of forgotten. We just assume that this has always been here, it was always going to be here, and then we based all of our hopes and dreams and visions of the future on it. So this industrial mentality fueled by this energy inheritance has encouraged us to live like there's no consequences. We can essentially buy our way out of every problem with all this stored up energy. Meanwhile, imposing our machine metaphor and industrial thinking everywhere we go. So I'm going to use the example of agriculture because I think it perfectly illustrates exactly what I'm talking about. Fueled by our energy inheritance, we start imposing these industrial patterns onto the landscape. We clear. Simplicity. Let's start with a nice blank slate. We laser level. We do all this great stuff. Right? Obviously, there's biodiversity impacts to all of this. You know, you're killing things, you're knocking stuff down. But it destroys hydrology, ecosystems. I mean, In New Zealand alone, 78% of the native forest is gone, 90% of wetlands. Erosion, landslides, exposed landscapes, ready for imprinting this uniform monocultural production. And of course you get higher temperatures, you know, exposure to wind, landslips, all this kind of stuff. Tillage. All that's topsoil blowing off, in case you're wondering. This one's one of my favourites. I think it's called the turbo chisel. I think that's a great name. I don't know why someone would think that's a good idea to put on their land, but everyone's different. Monocultures. Simplicity, conformity. Now this is great. It's great if you're a pest or a pathogen or a weed. It's bad for soil life, bad for moisture, nutrients, biodiversity, pollinators, you name it. We ignore the complexity that's actually there, and instead we apply this simplified thinking to try and manage it. So that leads us to this. So there's no ecosystem cycles. We ram fossil fuel inputs into lifeless dirt. There's no understanding ecology, species interactions. No, we poison to remove and to simplify. There is no landscape function, no complexity, simply pasture or not pasture, for example. We encourage economies of scale, ignoring impacts on the environment and welfare. We want to maximise yield as much as possible. Efficiency is the guiding principle. And everything is an input or an output, a product. You know, there's a reason they call it factory farming. It's about the bottom line. These things are all about maximising profit. Impacts are called externalities. They happen somewhere else. And of course, these people don't pay for that. We pay for that. But it's all made possible and propped up by this energy inheritance. None of this would be possible. None of it was possible until we had that. But the question, isn't this the foundation for our civilization? I mean, isn't it necessary? Don't we need it to feed the world? Well, let's have a quick recap then. Health, nutrition, this is probably one of my favourites. Going back to 1940 shows the level of every nutrient in almost every kind of food has fallen between 10 and 100%. So you need to eat 3 times as much fruit, 4 to 5 times as many vegetables to obtain the same amount of nutrients as you did in 1940. And I think I've heard over the years many people say things like, you know, strawberries don't taste like they did when I was a kid. You know, some of that might be fanciful thinking, but I think, you know, you hear it enough that it does make you, you know, makes you wonder. Is it efficient? Does it provide good health outcomes? What about yield? Well, it produces less than 30% of the world's food, these systems. And half of that goes to animal feedlots and biofuels, so actually isn't even going to food anyway. This is about making money. This is not about feeding people. 70% comes from peasants and smallholding farmers all around the world who do it with a lot less and a lot better in a lot of cases. So the bottom line, these systems are not viable without this energy inheritance. And it's going to run out anyway, even if it wasn't helping us to destroy human civilization. So we need to do something about it anyway. This is no basis for a long-term food system. I think that should be abundantly clear. If we want to have a permanent civilization on this planet, we need to have permanent agriculture. And this is not going to do it, because this can only end one way, this industrial mentality. So what do we need to do? Okay, so we need new thinking, obviously, because that old thinking is not going to get us where we need to go. It's time to get real. So what do I mean by that? We need to be dealing with reality, real things. A human can survive for 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. Those are real. It doesn't matter what you think about it. That's the reality. All of our basic needs are supplied by the natural world. Water, resources, food, etc. The food system that's propped up by the inheritance, by the trust fund, is risky, and it's not, as I've said, a basis for long-term survival. These concerns are real. Imaginary things, and I use the word imaginary a bit loosely. But, you know, just to contrast, laws, customs, rules, economics, money. These are things that we invented. These things that only exist in human brains. If all humans on Earth disappeared or had some sort of alien mind wipe, these things would disappear along with it. But the weird and perverse thing is what we've done is we've taken the real things and we have made them subservient to the imaginary things. So we place the imaginary things first and then say, well, the real stuff can just kind of work itself out. Is it possible to produce food forever? This was the question that I guess really got me started in all this when I started thinking about all this stuff. And it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, you can't just Google it. Tried. But once you sort of dig in and you research this and you do actually kind of get to the bottom of how it might be possible, you realise, yes, actually the answer is yes. And that is maybe the ultimate question, because what it means is human society possible forever? Or does it have a fixed end-by date? Even if we don't know when that is it going to end one day or can it go on forever? And then once you realise that, it's pretty huge. So then you have to say, well, okay, so how does that work, What should it look like? We need to be thinking in closed loops. This is how natural systems work. Waste is a human invention. It doesn't exist in nature. Everything is cycled. The output of one thing is the input of another. We had to invent something else that created waste. We just didn't know what to do with it. That was a failure of human imagination. We need to embrace complexity because that's what we're dealing with. It's not just a nice thing to do. It is what's out there. And it's harming us that we're not embracing it properly. Systems thinking. How do these things all link together? How do the crises all link together? How do the solutions all link together? Unless we start trying to grapple with that, how do we expect to be able to deal with it? And we need new patterns. Let's look to the ones that are already out there. Because nature is full of patterns. And when you start asking, well, why? Why do we keep seeing these recurring patterns, dendritic patterns, etc.? Why? Well, they teach us something about the efficiencies that are found in nature. And we need to live within our real-time energy budget. The energy that is coming from the sun or wherever, things that are happening real-time every second, not just trying to live off this stored inheritance. Which leads us to an example of what that looks like when you start to work with new patterns and you stop imposing patterns. So instead of imposing simplicity, we manage complexity. So what is regenerative agriculture? Maybe a definition would be helpful. It is the design and management of productive land use through mimicry of diverse natural ecosystems. It harnesses and restores ecological function to produce food, fibre and fuel. Informed by observation of and continual adjustment to feedback. All of those parts are important. You're working with what's there, the complexity that's there. You're trying to understand it. You're harnessing it because things want to grow. Plants want to grow. The trick is nudging the ones that you want to be doing what you want, when you want. Within these natural systems, producing what you need and adjusting to feedback, looking at what the land is telling you. So we hear these terms bandied about a lot. What is the difference to sustainable, regenerative? What's it all about? Well, I like to go back to kind of the dictionary definitions here. Sustainable is something that can be sustained. It can be maintained forever. Right? It does not have an end. It is just sustained. Regenerative is this process of regeneration, right? Restoring. To be sustainable, a landscape must be managed in a way that's regenerative. So you're talking about the same thing here. The reason why that is, and this is maybe something a lot of people miss, is because ecosystems are not static. They don't stand still. They're either degrading or they're regenerating. Now, they can be doing one of those things very slowly or very fast, but they don't just stay still. Ecologists would call that a dynamic equilibrium. It's just a constantly shifting state. And this is actually what underpins how Regen Ag works. It works by sort of balancing disturbance and regeneration. And every time it's like pressing down a bit on like a rubber ball or something. It wants to spring back. So you time your disturbance very well and you use that energy that's created, that's springing back to produce something. But be careful, you will hear a lot of greenwash and a lot of people appropriate these terms all over the place. So to understand, I guess, whether something really is sustainable or regenerative, it's useful to know what that might look like and try to actually say what's actually going on here. So it is knowledge, not process-based, okay? There are a lot of different regen ag methodologies, but they all have something in common. They all have an approach in common, and they all have the same sort of goals. This is what unites them, are these sort of principles here. They're integrated, they maximize diversity, they stack function. You know, we are using the science of the natural world, that we understand how ecosystems work, how soils work, how plants and animals interact. And we try things on the ground. People have been doing this for decades, and they've found what works. The principles are, once you sort of understand them, are fairly self-evident. But what's really fascinating is that it looks remarkably different sometimes, because instead of just going in and saying we're going to produce one thing, this is a field, we're going to be growing corn. You might go in and say, okay, well, let's grow a number of things and let's try and grow them on top of each other. So for, 5 square meters, I might have 6 things that are growing. That gives me 6 businesses potentially, 6 income streams. I'm no longer exposed to market prices. I'm no longer as exposed to freak weather. Something is always going to be growing. And these things can help each other as well. And that's the power. Because this is how natural ecosystems have evolved over hundreds of millions of years. And I mean, anyone who's a financial investor or understands this idea. You get resilience through diversity. So we protect and build living soil, because this is the foundation for everything else, of all life. Despite all of our amazing accomplishments as a species, we owe it all to a very thin layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. Without either of those things, nothing else would be possible. So we increase biomass, we don't till, we don't disturb the soil, we build topsoil, we sequester carbon, we harness photosynthesis. We try and help it do what it wants to do anyway. We direct it towards a use that's helpful for us. We focus and respect webs, cycles, and loops. Whether that be in the soil, whether that be the hydrological cycle, we understand that we're part of lots of things that are going on here, and we try and farm intelligently. We're responsive to our context. We understand what's the climate that we're in, what's the topography, where is water going, where do I need it, how can I make these things fit together in a way that's helpful and useful. And it works everywhere, whether you've got abundant rainfall and pretty decent soil to start with, or whether you're working in Saudi Arabia in the desert. Good thinking, good understanding of your context, and good design can make a world of difference. It's designed and it's strategic, so we're planning. It's not haphazard. It's really, like I said, it's about understanding what's going on, seeing it for what it is, getting real, not coming along, imprinting this pre-decided idea of what I'm going to do on this land, but looking at what the land and trying to understand, look at it and understand what it's capable of, what's its function, what's it trying to be. There's a group of different methodologies which I guess would all sit under the Regen Ag umbrella. I'm not going to go through them all, but I think probably the key one is biological soil management, because as I said, soil sits under everything else. So even when you're doing any of these other things, knowingly or not, you are essentially managing soil biologically when you do these other things well. Holistic planned grazing is particularly powerful for grazing systems, but not every system's a grazing system. Where you are grazing, that's a great thing to do, but often you may want to incorporate trees into the environment. That's usually a good idea. And there's lots of different ways you can do it. Silver pasture, integrating grazing and trees, agroforestry, crops and trees, etc. And you can mix them all together. These are all quite, they work in syntropy with each other, which is why syntropic agriculture is a thing. Working with tree systems to try and regenerate rather than letting entropy take over. And these are the benefits. There's a lot of them, so I'm not going to go through and list them all. But you've pretty much gotten the idea from what I've talked about, that Regen Ag counters a lot of the problems that we were creating by doing things with an industrial mentality. But I think probably the key thing is that it's not just landscape benefits, climate benefits that we're getting from this. We get health and nutrition benefits. We also get community and economic benefits. Often where these things happen, this stimulates small local communities, which in turn encourages small local economies. It can rejuvenate regional areas that have been drained to fill up the cities. So you see a lot of other positive things come off the back of this. But maybe overall, the most important thing is that you get higher production, of useful human nutrition and products per square metre than any other system on Earth. Industrial systems can't even come close to this. They'll want to talk about total yield, they'll want to talk about efficiency, economies of scale, how much it's costing them. But when you break it down to what useful things you're getting out of it, this blows them away. So the question now is, so why am I focusing on agriculture? I mean, obviously that's what I work in, but why agriculture? Why not energy, transport? Well, I think hopefully it's become clear that whether we have a climate crisis or not, we still need to get this right. Only permanent agriculture supports permanent civilization. And Regenerative directly or indirectly helps address all of those crises that we face and can feed humanity forever. Okay, so we've got some answers. We talked about some great things that we could do differently. But how do we get there? If we were to look at our global society as an organisation for a second, Planet Inc., how would we change it? Because we might have all these great ideas, but it feels like there's pockets of engagement and activity in a sort of sea of inertia. So we need to find ways to actually move this thing forwards. These things already exist. In the corporate world, people would be familiar with the idea of change management. It's well established, it's based on psychological research. The one at the bottom here, the Kubler-Ross change curve, for example, was originally developed to help people deal with grief. But really what it's about is it's about helping people understand that change is scary and that people need support to move through it and to understand that there's a clear and distinct process to dealing with change. And this is used all the time in the largest organisations around the world. It has been for years. It's well understood. But not very well understood outside of those, sadly. Up the top, Kotter's 8-step change process. This is, just a framework for what are the steps that you need to take. And if you start thinking about this and applying it to sort of climate breakdown and all the crises we face, you can see that, we're sort of in this space up here in terms of where we're at. We're definitely not up here yet. We're sort of down here. We're still trying to create urgency in a lot of places. A lot of people are still, not there yet. On the change curve, this is pretty prominent. I think we could agree. Some people are here. Some people are here. But we're all in different places. And until we sort of recognise that, how do you deal with it? I mean, you're just going to let it randomly progress by itself? It doesn't. So, okay, so maybe we now understand that there are ways that we can think about how to move people forwards. And it's great to know how, but where? What does it look like? Where are we actually going? And that's where target operating model comes in. Again, pretty standard in business, in large organisations. Why? Because it's very important. You need to know where you're going. What does it look like when you get there? What does success look like? You need to be able to define that so that you can work backwards and ensure that everything you're doing between here and there is getting you closer. And strangely enough, this isn't something that anyone seems to be talking about. I have never heard anybody actually articulate a vision for what it looks like when we succeed. We're talking always about how can we just do what we're doing now less badly. So I think it's really important to visualise a goal. Now, it's the opposite of this incremental mitigation mindset. So to understand where we're going, we need to think about the end state and work backwards. We need to take this complexity that we're faced with and find a way to work with it into something that makes sense. So our target operating model, could look something like this. We start with land use. We've talked about all the good things that we could do there, but that's first, because those are the real needs that we have. Even if we don't have a society, if there's people, they need to eat. So we need to start there. But then we need to ask, well, what does that mean then? If we get that right, how does that change everything else? Are people still living all in cities? Probably not as many, I'd say. What does that mean for where people are living and how they're living? So then we start looking at the built environment and structures. What sort of structures do we need in this different society that we're building? How are they powered? Where are they? How do they connect with each other? And we start looking at energy. There's going to need to be a lot less of it being used, a lot less. But it's still going to have to be in there, so we need to think about that. And then how land use and structures affect that energy picture. And then transport, how do we get between these places? Where are these places? What are they? The economic model, really important, obviously. But we can't be placing that first. because that warps everything else. We need to understand all these other things really first before we then understand, well, what is the economics for? I mean, what do we have it for? And if it's not helping us with all these other things, then we need to change it. We need to design something better that is going to work in reality and is going to help us achieve all these other things. And then, of course, governments. We need to be looking at, what is the kind of governance that we've got, the kind of democracy, hopefully, that we've got, that's going to, again, be facilitating all this stuff and allowing it to work. We can't get there with the existing mindset. It must be intentionally designed, I believe. I don't think we're just going to stumble on this, because that's what's got us here in the first place in a lot of ways. So really, these are a lot of ideas. Now, this is stuff we need to be discussing, but we're not. There are lots more ideas out there as well, but they all need to be brought together, and we need to be thinking about things in this way. They're all achievable now, all of these things. These all exist, and they've all been done in some form or another. And I know that some people, I hear people say to me, I don't know if I can afford to think that long term. I'm trying to deal with all the problems that I've got now. And I understand that, But I would say, given what's coming down the line at us, we can't afford not to. Because it's not going to go away just by that. The world that we need simply won't fit within the rules of the world that we have. So this is where this conscious design bit comes in. The good news, however, is that our imagination dreamt all this up, all these problems, and it's our imagination that can get us out of it too, if we've got the courage to use it. So, we've looked at what the problem is. We realise that it's a series of interconnected crises of our own making, right? And we have a destructive status quo and a destructive mindset that's inappropriate, simplistic. We're imposing the wrong metaphor onto the land, onto the living systems that we depend upon, and that support us. We know that we've got answers, and we know that we can do things differently. We can do them better. We've got all the resources that we need from a thinking point of view to pull all this information together. Right? We know that we can create a secure and sustainable food system, but we need to define what that success picture looks like. And we need to then help manage people and groups through that to get there. We have all the answers, we just need to pull it together. Thank you.
We've got a little bit of time for questions. Any for Shane?
I think you were first.
Okay.
No worries. Right, there's a lot in that question. Okay, how can we transition? How do we deal with the fear of the risk, etc., the cost? I would say, first of all, we need to think, what's the cost of not doing it? Really, that's the first thing we need to be thinking about. Because if we're really going to be weighing up costs, if we're going to be looking at, what in the corporate world you call risk management, how are we managing our risks? How are we identifying our risks? You would be doing scenario modelling. If this was an oil company, we'd be, or a big multinational, we'd be employing people to run scenarios, to model what this would look like if we don't do something, if we do a little bit, if we do a lot. Unfortunately, this is the point, is a lot of this expertise, it exists, but it's not in the right places. But when you start thinking along those lines, the answers become pretty self-evident. In terms of, to bring it back to where do we start today, what do farmers do today? To be honest, some of these things, for example, biological soil management, if they are running a grazing system, holistic plant grazing, these are things that are kind of fairly low barrier to entry. These are things that can be learnt, within a matter of days with the right teaching. They can transition from the systems that they're already managing to doing it that way, which is already a huge improvement, right? You can be reducing inputs, you can be improving soil carbon, you can be improving animal health, you can be, in a grazing system. And it's the same even for orchards. A lot of these stuff are sort of low-hanging fruit, right? No one is suggesting that farmers should necessarily just stop what they're doing tomorrow and take on an all-singing, all-dancing, fully mature, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry system day one. It's, the approach. So, for example, if I was working with somebody, I would say, look, the three things we need to be doing is we need to be thinking strategically, we need to be thinking pragmatically and incrementally. Start with where we are now, and let's make sure that every step that we're doing is sensible and is heading us in the right direction. But, you need to start. Does that help answer? Yeah.
One of the key points you seem to focus on was close the loop. And I'm wondering whether our current system of high volume export agriculture with bulk shipping and massive quantities of commodities or athletes around the world is consistent with the vision of regenerative agriculture.
No. No, the way that the way that things are working now is not consistent with that. No, we're not closing any loops. We're doing the opposite. Most of the time, we're producing biomass and shipping it somewhere else, and that happens everywhere, to a large degree. And no, again, because that's what we focus on, isn't it? We focus on what's the product, how much can we sell it for, who's buying it, how do we get it there? That's it. That's the whole picture. No one's saying, well, what are the impacts? So there's all these other costs, there's all these other things, because we're not looking at the system, we're just looking at this part of it, and that's the business, unfortunately. Yeah.
A relatively small number of people are actually doing farming in the private sector.
Yeah.
They can't move if they just their private sector. It needs a system change in probably a lot of people, moving more into
Yes.
and being involved with the
Yeah.
that sort of system.
Yeah.
So you need buy-in of the whole population at the same time.
Well, I don't think we can afford to wait for it. I think that the first thing we need to be doing is shifting the systems we do have towards regenerative agriculture. I think that once we start on that path, there will be certain things that become self-evident. They don't all have to be smaller. I think, the point is not to go in and say it needs to be this size or that size or this many people or this many head of cattle on it or whatever. The point is you go in and you say, what is this landscape? How does it work? What's it want to do? How can we make this productive, right, without damaging it? How can we make it better over time, not worse? And from that, opportunities come up. So where this stuff has been done really well, people have gone in, they've started doing one thing. It might be grazing, it might be something else. And then as these systems have matured and people have gotten used to it, they've started adding different things. Now, what this has done is in some cases they've added separate business layers to what they're doing. So they may be grazing part of the year, they may be cropping part of the year, they may be producing tree crops or something else. But then also sometimes they're having this stacking of function, not just ecological function, but from an economic point of view. They've got other people which come on and can operate their own enterprises. And this is great. It's an employment solution. It's a regional development solution. There's lots of opportunities there. But the problem is that it's very difficult to have those opportunities if you go in with a very fixed mindset from the beginning and saying it has to look like this. So, but do we need everybody's buy-in? I don't know. I think it's what the entire human civilization is dependent upon feeding itself somehow. So. Do they need to be? Well, maybe. Yeah, because they're not teaching this stuff at universities. Interestingly, all the key ingredients are there. They'll teach. I don't know about in agriculture school, but I know, that if you're studying ecology or biological sciences, all the stuff that underpins this, it's all there. It's just not put together that way. Because they want to encourage people to go out and get jobs in agriculture, and you're not going to get a job in agriculture if you turn up and go, "What are you doing?" So.
And a lot of the time people say, government will need to do this or government will need to oversee this. And I think there are real problems with our government system as it exists at the moment. And it's worth remembering the comment of Jean-Claude Juncker when he was Prime Minister of Luxembourg. And there were mindset of politicians everywhere, and how are we going to encourage them to be more committed and more adventurous? And I didn't even mention New Zealand first.
Yeah. That is an exceptionally good question. Yeah, how do we get government to be changing in the way that it needs to, as fast as it needs to? Because, I mean, I don't have the answer to that, and it's different in every context. The thing which is quite apparent, though, is that what keeps happening is that I feel that there's this thing which keeps getting battered backwards and forwards, in the sense that you'll get governments and industry will say, you know, yeah, that's great, we need to do all this stuff, but people really need to change the way they live. They need to change their lifestyles. They need to not be hypocrites. They need to, you know, be cutting back on their demands. You know, we're just giving them what they ask for, which is, you know, rubbish. I was going to say something else, but there's miners in the room. You know, yeah, that's true. We do need to do all those things, absolutely. But I mean, when you look at the reality of it, that's not gonna do it. You know, we do need governments because there are certain kinds of decisions, certain kinds of changes at certain levels that can only be done at that level. You know, the system makes hypocrites of all of us. You know, what are our choices really? I mean, can everyone just go out right now and buy a brand new electric car? Not that that's the answer anyway. But you know, but even if you could, like it's not real. It's a false choice. You know, we need to be given meaningful choices, and that needs to come from, you know, from on high. We can't just. There are people who've been marketing these lifestyles at us for decades about, you know, aspirational goals and all this, and now they turn around and say, oh well, you know, but we're just selling you what you buy. It's like, no, we're buying what you've been telling us we need for 30, 40, 50 years. You know. Yes, we do need systemic change, and we need to be working on it. But I think the first part is people need to understand the problem. They need to understand what's at stake, and they need to start having real conversations about how we might change it and what it looks like. Zero inputs. Yeah. Because, well, I mean, I'm not going to go into all the details. We don't have time for all that science of how that works. But the headline is this: these are all zero input systems. Because if they're not, how can they be sustainable? If your system can only function if it's propped up from something outside, then the moment that ends, so does your system. You know, or even if somehow that input was available forevermore, yeah, it's completely exposed to that risk of the input. It's dependent, right? It's not self-sustaining. So yeah, zero input systems are much better for fresh water. You know, I've been talking with Mike about, you know, with runoff and things like that. There shouldn't be any runoff. Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. But I mean, look, you know, in a nutshell, if you're talking about things like nitrate runoff, you shouldn't be, you know, if you need to be dumping lots of synthetic chemicals on your system, then maybe it's not designed properly, or you're not managing it properly. If it's, you know, that's what you need to be doing to keeping it going. In terms of, you know, sediment runoff, that sort of stuff, I mean, again, you know, if you've got loads of water and material running off your farm, then that's a resource that you're not harvesting. You're not managing that resource appropriately. But the problem is usually we're starting from the position of, well, this is my business, so this is what needs to happen. But of course, that's the thinking that got us here, so we need to change that. Yes, well, I mean, there are lots of different ideas. Probably the most popular one is using what we call the detrital food chain, so composting, basically. There are plenty of safe ways to compost human waste that take away all the pathogens and that use it as an input. Because again, this is all about closing loops. This is about taking the output of one thing, if it's humans, and using it as an input for something else. There's worm systems, there's composting. I mean, this is what nature does. It already exists, it already happens. It happened before we even came along as a species, and we're just not utilising it. Instead, we prefer to build big infrastructure projects and pipe it somewhere and deal with it with, you know, some other way that's expensive. Yeah. Oh, that's Sir Ken Robinson. Yeah, Changing Education Paradigms. He's done quite a few, but that's particularly a good one. Yeah. big scale. Yeah, I mean, some of these things have been done at a big scale. Again, they're all different because they're all responsive to their own context, right? So, yes, catchment scale definitely, you know, I'd say, yeah. I mean, regional scale, not exactly, I mean, unfortunately, but I would say some of the good examples to check out. If people want to sort of see some other examples of this and see people that are doing it, some people to check out are Mark Shepard, and he runs New Forest Farm in Wisconsin. And I've used quite a few of the images from his place. I think his is probably, I would say, one of the most sophisticated ones. I mean, that's kind of like what it could look like over time. It wouldn't be a day one operation. And his certainly hasn't been. Joel Salatin, he's quite famous in certain circles. His system, Polyface Farms, is really good as well. I would say Gabe Brown, another American farmer. He's mostly beef, but you know he's been doing amazing things on his land. In New Zealand, Greg Hart in Hawke's Bay has been doing some great things as well, modelled on Joel Salatin's Polyface Farms model. Yeah, so these are some top 4 people to check out, and there you can see some of these practices put into action. Are those catchment level? Not quite. Oh, yeah, sorry. So in terms of catchment level, I would say probably the better systems are, they're mostly holistic managed grazing. So they're predominantly grazing using biological soil management and holistic planned grazing. Not so much agroforestry systems, although I have seen people building designs for these, but I don't know if they've been implemented yet. But I know like a lot of work's been done in broad scale in Patagonia, Northern Australia. There's like, we're talking thousands of hectares type of systems. Yeah, well, actually, some of the examples that I've just mentioned, these people, they're on my website. Yeah, there's a journal section, which is like a blog, and I've got a few bits up there. But, feel free to, connect with me on LinkedIn or email me, contact me, and I'm happy to provide you any information you might like. It's not at this stage, but I can perhaps make some of that available.
Sure. Okay, we better wind up because we've run out of time, but Shane's around for a bit and we're going to go to lunch if anybody's keen to come along and see it. Thanks very much for coming along.
Thank you.